Every year, the members of Autopstream pick 31 films based around a certain theme to rank in honor of October 31st. And if you're not aware, Autopstream is a collective of YouTubers, including like Cody Leach, Brian Lomax, Sean Chandler, Willie Screedia, a few other guys. And every year they've been doing this 31 on 31 ranking. And to clarify, I'm not part of their group. I'm just a dude with 20 subscribers who likes movies. But this year I saw the list of films which Cody posted on his channel as being the movies they're going to rank. And at least half of them I'd either already seen or they were movies that I've been planning to see for a while and just hadn't got around to yet. And so I thought, hey, it would be fun to watch all these movies in the lead up to their rankings and offer my own ranking for what it's worth. Hopefully I'm not like breaking a copyright by doing this or something, but I thought it would be an ambitious challenge for me since I've never done a video even close to this long before. There's a "that's what she said" joke in there somewhere. I'm just gonna skip it. So this year's theme is the new breed. So it's, I guess, a bunch of filmmakers who have made their mark on the horror genre over the course of the last 10 to 15 years, including, let's look at this list: Alexander Aja, Ari Aster, Brandon Cronenberg, Damien Leone, Fede Alvarez, James Wan, Jordan Peele, Julia Ducournau, I believe that's how her name is pronounced, Mike Flanagan, Osgood Perkins, Parker Finn, Radio Silence, Scott Derrickson, and Ty West. So that's a bunch of filmmakers. Many of the films on this list are the kind of movies that got me into horror, so I thought this was pretty cool. As always, my opinion is the objectively correct opinion, so if you disagree with me, you are wrong, but it's okay to be wrong. Tell me in the comments if you're wrong. I will be posting the videos from the actual Autopstream members in the description. I'll post all those links as soon as I get them. And those videos are going to be a lot higher quality than this one, so make sure to check those out. They're always really fun and entertaining, especially if you're into, horror films and whatnot. And with that said, let's jump into the list. Starting with number 31, dead last is Dead Silence. This is the only movie on this list that legitimately felt like a chore to get through. It's so boring and stupid, but despite that, I'm kind of glad that it's part of the list because I think it exemplifies a lot of qualities that James Wan frequently brings to his films. The way it just throws one cliche at you after another, the way it constantly goes for the cheap jump scare instead of going for something a little bit more subtle or a little bit more elevated that would be more memorable. The way the plot beats are just so cliche and obligatory that they just leave me grasping for anything that feels remotely original or interesting. These are all qualities that James Wan movies routinely exhibit, and while I don't think any of his other movies are as bad as this one, the point still stands that this is what the guy does. Another major pain point is the acting. The leading guy in this movie is just terrible. But even if he was a good actor, I don't think he could save a lot of this dialogue from sounding stupid and make the movie be any less dumb. By the end, when we have like CGI demon faces warping out of plastic dolls, I don't think Daniel Day-Lewis could have made this movie work. If it wasn't for like the last minute or so of the movie where there's this kind of sudden twist, I don't think anyone would even be talking about this movie anymore. Yeah, this is definitely the worst one here. At number 30 is Malignant, another James Wan movie. And the argument I've heard in defense of this one is that it's trying to be bad. Like, it's a throwback to a different era of horror, a lot of defenders would say. But I don't see how that excuses the fact that it's still just a bad movie. Even though this movie does have some relatively creative ideas, they're just presented in such a formulaic way that I can't really enjoy them very much. I'm not the type to typically notice or point out logistical or realism errors, so you know that the plot holes in Malignant are pretty big when even I'm noticing them and laughing at them. There are major plot points that are silly and illogical. The characters continuously just make the stupidest decisions, and the entire premise is so, stupid that if it was in a better movie, I would actually kind of love it. But because this is a James Wan movie, it never progresses beyond the point of just being, well, a James Wan movie. See my description of Dead Silence for more on what that entails. Thankfully, though, this is the end of James Wan on this list, and coincidentally, it's all uphill from here. At number 29 is Terrifier, and no one is more shocked by this placement than me. This was a movie that I deliberately avoided, and when I saw it on this list, I thought the bottom 3 slots were going to be taken up by the 3 Terrifier movies. So, imagine my surprise when I discovered that this movie actually has some degree of merit to it. Damien Leone is a good artist, even if he chooses to use his artistic powers for evil. And he brings a level of artistry to this series, more so to parts 2 and 3, but to this one as well, that elevate it above the trash heap where it would belong by all rights. With that said, though, this still isn't a good movie. The characters are terrible, and the decisions they make are just so dumb. Like, I get that if you're in a dire situation, you're not necessarily going to be thinking clearly, especially if you're as low IQ as the girls in this movie. But at a certain point, it just becomes like, you have a chance to escape right now. Why are you not running? No, why are you going back into the building, back into an enclosed space where you're obviously going to get trapped and get killed? Like, it's just, come on. So this is not a great movie, but it does have a germ of potential that future installments would go on to use to greater success, as we'll get into in a bit. At number 28 is Titan. And Titan it's a weird movie. At number 27 is The Blackcoat's Daughter. Okay, I'll talk a little bit more about it. This one is definitely the biggest WTF moment on this entire list, and that's really saying something because there are some weird movies on this list. It's hard to overstate how bizarre this movie is. It has some interesting ideas, like I guess it wants to talk about like what it means to be a family, but those ideas are not presented in a way that is really entertaining or enjoyable. And I get that not all movies have to be entertainment, and this movie kind of feels like the epitome of that. But I still want to be able to get some degree of enjoyment out of the movie. And for much of Titan, I just can't really do that. It's a really messy movie that just kind of jumps from one thing to another and makes you play catch up. And all the chaos doesn't really come together in the end in a really satisfying way. It's just like, here's a platter full of complete and utter insanity. All right, bye now. This is one where I just don't really get the hype. Maybe if I decided to watch it again, I would be able to get more out of it, but I don't really feel particularly compelled to go back to it. So yeah, that's where I'm at with this one. It's not for me. At number 27 is The Blackcoat's Daughter, and I genuinely don't know if I'm just stupid or if this movie is confusing as shit. Probably both are the case, to be honest. But I was in a state of complete and utter bewilderment for most of the runtime of this movie. The only thing I was somehow able to understand was the twist, which was so poorly concealed, it literally took me like half the movie to realize it was even supposed to be a twist. I eventually did look up the Wikipedia plot summary, and that made it make sense a little bit more, but that still didn't really raise my opinion of the movie all that much. This is one of the worst cases I've ever had of feeling like I saw a different film from everybody else. Like, I'm reading all these IMDb reviews talking about all this stuff, and I'm just like, what movie did you see? I feel like Osgood Perkins is good at creating a sense of creepy atmosphere, but not necessarily at telling stories that I actually am engaged with and actually want to see. There are some echoes here of what he would go on to do much better in Longlegs, but for now, those things just don't feel very satisfying. I don't hate it, but I think it's safe to say, like with Titan, I don't get it. At number 26 is Maxine, and this is by far the weakest chapter in Ty West's X trilogy. The word that comes to mind most with this one is unremarkable. Like, I just don't have that much to say about it. It's competently and sometimes even artfully made, and Kevin Bacon chewing up the scenery is like a fun element to it, but other than that, there's just not that much going for it. Maybe I'm missing some kind of symbolism that makes the movie great or something. I can't tell, but I didn't have that much fun watching it. And since I saw it, it's actually gone down for me. I liked it more back when I initially saw it. Thankfully, we still have the first two movies to cherish, and those will be coming up much higher on the list. But yeah, for now, Maxine is at number 26. At number 25, I've got The Exorcism of Emily Rose, and this is a movie that's more interesting in concept than it is actually satisfying to watch. The premise is right up my alley. I love the idea of turning an exorcism movie into a courtroom drama. I like the central conflict, which is between this agnostic lawyer who basically finds herself in the position of having to defend the existence of the spiritual realm versus this religious lawyer who basically thinks that spirituality has nothing to do with this case and that the defendant, this priest, is actually a murderer. So this could have easily been like top 10 on the list. But unfortunately, once we start getting flashback sequences and we start seeing the traditional horror elements, things quickly take a turn for the worse. All of the horror scenes are done using CGI, and the early 2000s CGI that they're using does not look good. So it's just really not scary. And the movie presents all of the horror scenes in really cliche, dumb ways. Like when we finally get to the exorcism scene, you know, everyone's yelling and screaming and there's chaos and whatnot. And then suddenly like snakes just appear for no reason and start like trying to attack people. Why? Because snakes are scary, I guess. The ending is also pretty dumb, and I think it fails to make the case that it's trying to make. Thankfully, Scott Derrickson would go on to greatly improve his craft in future films. And speaking of filmmakers improving their craft, at number 24 is Terrifier 2. And Damien Leone does improve his craft with this movie. Yet the more I think about this one, the more of a frustration it becomes for me. Like, they were so close. All the elements are here to be the next great slasher film. You've got great characters who I'd love to follow through multiple films. You've got an intriguing mythology that's fun to dive into. You've got gnarly kills. And of course, you've got this absolutely iconic killer in Art the Clown. But damn it, this movie's long. The pacing is so slow that it just kills the movie for me. It feels so incredibly self-indulgent, which made a lot of sense when I discovered that Leone actually did the editing himself, so he's just unwilling to cut any of his darlings. By the end, I'm exhausted. I just want the movie to be over, but it just keeps piling more and more and more onto my plate. I am done with this movie way before it's done with me, and that is a very frustrating feeling. So this movie is not meritless by any means, but it is frustrating, and that's why I think even though this one has some better moments, Terrifier 3 is ultimately better, and that's why it's going to be higher on this list. At number 23 is Never Let Go, and this is another prime example of a movie with an awesome concept that is just kind of messed up in execution. Even though, obviously, I know Alexander Aja is the one that came up with the concept, I think he was the wrong filmmaker to actually make this movie because he's just a bit too commercial to take this movie to the places it needed to go. There's still plenty of good stuff here. There's one scene in particular, the scene at the shed, which is kind of like a turning point in the movie that I thought was actually a really great scene. But I just wish that they could have kept up that level of quality through to the end. Instead, though, they kind of go in this direction that's very meh. They get very sentimental, and it just doesn't work. The ending also ends up leaving a lot of questions open that I wish I didn't have to ask, which is also kind of annoying. It was really close, but I couldn't quite give this one a positive review. But from this point forward, all the rest of the movies on this list are positive. Even though these next few, I do have some issues with them, these are all more or less positive review films. Starting with number 22, which is Ouija Origin of Evil. And this is one of those movies that took advantage of the trend of like supernatural horror slash family drama movies that was kind of started by James Wan in the 2010s. And this movie mostly works due to the strength of that family drama, as well as having a few decent scares. The characters are good. I love the fact that it's about this family that is like pretending to be psychic, pretending to be in connection with the spiritual realm. And so when like supernatural things actually start happening, it's a bit weird to them and they're a bit late to kind of figure it out. But the movie has one big bug, and that is its reliance on CGI. And it's almost weird how much the movie just unapologetically leans into it. And it's not like the CGI they're using is state of the art. It's really dopey and bad looking CGI. And so it makes a lot of the scenes where they rely on CGI just feel not very scary. And they especially rely a lot on the CGI towards the end of the movie when things kind of start to predictably ramp up and escalate. And I feel like it makes the ending not feel like a satisfying conclusion to the story we've been watching over an hour up until that point. Still, this is a totally adequate supernatural horror film that has some good ideas, and again, it's overall a positive experience. At number 21 is Smile 2, and this is the most recent movie on this list, so I haven't had quite as much time to sit with it and digest it as some of the other movies on this list, but it's been like, a week or so I think that's enough time for me to basically get my opinion in order on what I think of it. I went into this movie super hesitant, thinking that I was just going to be bored, and despite some issues that I'll get into in a second, I found this to be another totally adequate and well-made supernatural horror film. I think the technical aspects are absolutely on point. It's got great cinematography, and there were even a couple scenes that I found to be legitimately scary, which was quite a shock to me. So I more or less enjoyed it. But the reason it's not a lot higher on this list is in large part due to the ending. When I first saw it, I didn't immediately register how much of an issue it was going to be, but the more that I've thought about it since then, the more butthurt I've gotten about it. I'll try to dance around spoiling anything, but it kind of feels like an FU to the audience for sitting through the last half hour of the movie. And I guess some people will enjoy being flipped off in that way, but I did not appreciate it, and I think it really hurt the movie. So it's very artfully made and has some great moments, but it really suffers because of that ending. At number 20 is Terrifier 3, and this is the most brutal and disturbing of the Terrifier movies, which means it's basically the most brutal and disturbing movie on this list. The places this thing goes to are just downright mean. Like I discussed in my review, movies like these Terrifier movies where it's just people constantly getting brutalized in the most agonizing possible ways are always a bit of a hard sell for me. But Damien Leone has managed to bring me around to it just a little with some of the things that he does. This one, like part 2, has a lot of elements that are really well done and keep me engaged. One part that I didn't mention in my review is just how funny this movie is. Like, there are some genuinely hilarious scenes. A fan favorite seems to be the scene where Art has Sienna tied up in this chair and he's like walking back and forth getting saws and tubes and whatnot, and every time he walks by her he like smacks her in the back of the head, not in like a really harsh way, but just in this way that's super petty, and I found it to be really funny. My whole theater was laughing at that one. So it's, even though it is really brutal and sick and nasty, it also manages to get in those funny moments, which I appreciate. Some levity in the mix of this absolute just depravity. I also have just gotten so invested in these characters and in this story that I can't wait for like the big showdown between Art and Sienna, where the sword is actually on fire and the armor is actually made of steel. Like, that's gonna be so badass, and I'm actually anticipating Terrifier 4, as crazy as that sounds. So While I do always have to kind of put up a fuss about over-the-top pointless violence in movies, Terrifier 3 is still more or less a winner for me. At number 19 is Crawl, and simplicity is the name of the game with this one. There is absolutely nothing fancy going on here. It's just a story of one woman just trying to save her dad from alligators while surviving a hurricane in Florida. And it's pretty solid. Because there just aren't that many moving parts, it would have been hard for this movie to get tangled up and trip over its own feet and fail, so it's not really all that surprising that it does end up being a success. But the simplicity of it is a bit of a two-edged sword because there just isn't that much potential to be great here, so that's why it's ranked a little lower than some of the others on this list. This is basically just a solid 90-minute little thriller with some tense moments. Nothing more, nothing less. At number 18 is Alien Romulus, and this movie feels like the Force Awakens of the Alien franchise, except made by a filmmaker who's actually creative. Like, this movie has a lot of the pitfalls of movies like The Force Awakens, where it doesn't do anything all that creative or fresh, and it has a lot of callbacks that are kind of awkward. However, it's made by a filmmaker who actually has good ideas and isn't going to trample on what you love. Like, I won't spoil anything about the movie, but I can promise that it will not feature a scene of Ripley being stabbed and thrown off a bridge by her evil alien-obsessed daughter. What it does contain, though, are some really clever and well-crafted scenes that showcase what Fede Alvarez does best, which is putting his characters into tense situations. The standout moment that I always go back to with this movie is the scene where they have to turn off the artificial gravity and float through this field of alien blood. And it's such a clever use of the alien concept. One of the best we've seen in this franchise. I just love it. Fede Alvarez is a filmmaker who on his worst days is a little too commercial for my pretentious tastes, I guess. But on his best days, he creates kick-ass thrillers, and Alien Romulus feels like a bit of a mixture of both. At number 17 is Infinity Pool, and this is from Brandon Cronenberg, who is taking up the mantle from his father, David Cronenberg, as a filmmaker who loves to mar the human body. We'll talk about his breakout film Possessor a little bit later on this list, but as far as Infinity Pool goes, this is a bit of a weird one. It has this really awesome sci-fi concept where basically there's this fictional, I guess, South American or Central American island where they have this very strict system of law, where basically if you kill someone even by mistake, you get the death sentence. However, if you're a rich tourist on the island, then you have the ability to pay for this exact replica of you to be made, this exact clone, and the clone can then take the punishment instead of you. And if you think that gives you an idea of where this movie is going, then you're probably wrong, because this thing kind of just spins out from that concept to some really bizarre places where you just don't know what the hell is exactly going to happen next. This is a messy movie, and it goes off on a lot of tangents and does some things that to me read as just being kind of weird for the sake of being weird. I also don't think it fully explores the sci-fi concept to its fullest extent, but in all the messiness, it does have an important idea to explore, which is the idea that the rich get treated differently in almost every society. And that's not exactly a new idea. I mean, it's been around for as long as the rich have been around, but I think Infinity Pool takes a stab at exploring that idea in a way that's pretty creative and fresh. I also love that Tim Hecker did the score. I was watching the movie and I was like, this music sounds like it was made by like Tim Hecker. And so I Googled it, and sure enough, he's the one that did the score. So I thought that was kind of neat. But yeah, I mess with Infinity Pool. I guess it's my kind of weird. At number 16 is Smile, and my summation of this movie at the end of my review was that basically it has one foot in the A24 lane and the other firmly planted in the James Wan playbook. And what that looks like is that this movie has a lot of really great ideas that elevate it. I love how it focuses on psychological ideas, like the way that traumatic experiences affect the people who experience them, and the way that that can change people's behavior and lead them down a dark path. I also just think Parker Finn is a great technical filmmaker, like I mentioned with Smile 2. Even the score with like these dissonant strings and whatnot really gives me like an A24 vibe, which for me is a good thing because I've had a great track record with liking the kinds of movies that they do. But unfortunately, it also feels like this movie pulls not one page, but like multiple pages from the James Wan playbook. And what I mean by that is that it'll set up these really creepy scenes, but then it always punctuates them with either a jump scare or some other kind of cliche. Like, for instance, someone will just start talking in a deep, gravelly, multi-layered voice because that equals scary. And it's like the tension and atmosphere only exist to be dispelled immediately by somebody jumping out and saying boo. So the impact and the punch that an A24 film would have are just missing here. So overall, I liked it, but I think it could have been stronger. At number 15 is Longlegs, and this is one where almost immediately after publishing my review, I knew that I had been a bit too hard on it. Like, I still stand by most of the points that I made in that video, it's just that the language and the tone I would use now would be much softer. I think the movie was vastly overrated, and I think that is part of why it contributed to my very unimpressed reaction initially. But I like this movie, and I think it takes a lot of elements that Osgood Perkins has been playing with for a while and puts them into a context where they actually work. But despite my slight change of opinion, I still think this movie has flaws. One point that I didn't make in my review because I hadn't fully formulated it yet is that I think this movie suffers from having too much Nick Cage. And I say that as someone who is a fan of Nick Cage, but I think it was a mistake to open the movie by showing him to us. If they had waited a bit and built up to him more, his reveal would have been a lot more scary and a little bit more impactful. He just feels like kind of part of the movie who's a little bit funny, a little bit scary, but nowhere close to as ominous or creepy as he could have been. So this isn't a perfect film, but it does make me optimistic because I don't think we've seen Osgood Perkins' masterpiece yet. I think one of these days he's going to come out with something that's going to really impress me. But for now, yeah, Longlegs is at number 15. At number 14 is Ready or Not 2, also known as Abigail. The reason this one isn't up there with Radio Silence's other film, Ready or Not, is because the characters in this one just don't feel as interesting to me. You've got some pretty big names here, the biggest of which is probably Dave Bautista, but to me, with the exception of Abigail herself, this ensemble of personalities just does not really feel top-notch. They're still perfectly adequate for the movie they're in, though, and the movie they're in is a totally kick-ass vampire movie. Like, I think Abigail is one of the awesomest villains in modern horror. The performance from this girl, Abigail Weir, is so good. Like, she does such a good job of selling the two sides of this character, where she starts out as like this helpless kid who's just like, please don't hurt me. And then, eventually, obviously, the handcuffs come off and she becomes this vicious vampire. And she really sells both sides of that character so well. She's not the only good thing here, though. I mean, the way the story unfolds has a kind of alien-like appeal, where everybody's trapped in here and they're trying to get out and trying to survive the monster that's been let loose. And it's fun watching how each of them kind of gets picked off, even if I'm not necessarily like super connected to every single character here. Yeah, this is a totally fun and enjoyable movie. For now, this is where I'm placing it. At number 13 is Nope. This is Jordan Peele's third film, and yes, it is actually my least favorite of the three. But that's just a testament to how great of a filmmaker Jordan Peele is, because this movie's pretty solid. A flying saucer horror movie is definitely not the direction I expected him to go in after Us, but I welcome it with open arms, okay? Aliens have not been scary since I don't even know when, so the fact that this movie makes aliens scary again is really great. Like, 3 cheers for that. Also unexpected is the themes that this movie takes on, where with the last couple movies, he was tackling issues like race and class, which is these more like political issues. But if you thought he was going to be pigeonholed into that lane, which I sort of thought that he would be, you would be wrong, because in this movie, he mainly wants to explore the exploitation of animals as well as the lengths that people will go to pursue fame. And that's an interesting angle for an alien movie to explore. Like, I can't think of any other movie that really does what this movie does and comes at it with this angle. Maybe there's another example that's staring me right in the face that I'm forgetting, but what I mean to say is that this movie is original. The only part that's still a bit of a hard sell for me is just how slow-paced the movie is. I really enjoy it, and there are some great moments that are worth the wait. Absolutely worth the wait. But I just think I would have enjoyed the movie a little bit more if it was just a bit quicker. I mean, maybe I'm just being a baby. Feel free to tell me if I am in the comments. But yeah, I really enjoy this movie, and this is where I'm putting it. At number 12 is going to be Raw. And the first time I saw this movie, I wrote down this line. I wrote down, I didn't know it was possible to make a so-so cannibal movie, but that's exactly what Julia Ducournau has done with Raw. In other words, I did not like it. But on a second viewing, I have come to change my opinion quite drastically. What I didn't realize the first time going in is that the heart of this movie really is this relationship between these two sisters, where you've got this younger sister, Justine, who is the nice vegetarian who's just leaving the house for the first time to go to college, and you've got this older sister, Alexia, who is been out of her parents' care for a while, and she's much more assertive and confident and whatnot. And so that creates some tension between these two that just slowly grows and grows throughout the film until by the end it boils over and things start to get bloody. The cannibal angle almost feels more like a spice that's added to the mix. That's probably understating it a little. It's more like the canvas on which this story is being painted, if you will. And that's going to be a bit of a hard sell for a lot of people. It was difficult for me to accept the first time that I saw it too. But if you're one of those people who saw it maybe one time and went, this is garbage, I would recommend giving it another watch and, again, paying attention to that relationship, because that really is the core of the movie. And I think it's a really satisfying story that's there. At number 11 is Oculus. This is a really solid supernatural / psychological horror film about two siblings fighting an evil mirror, and I like it. If you think that premise sounds stupid, you really have to see how the movie handles it, because it's pretty cool. The idea that there's this mirror that has the power to corrupt people that get within range of it, as well as defending itself against people who want to harm it, is so cool. It's like a radioactive object where it takes genuine ingenuity to figure out a way to destroy it. But it's not just the cool supernatural concept that I love. I also really like the psychological angle to it, which is explored quite cleverly by using the two parallel timelines that kind of converge towards the end. Yeah, this movie's awesome. It's pretty dope. At number 10 is Pearl. And this is a prequel to Ty West's X, where we basically see what drove Pearl, the slasher in that movie, to the homicidal place that she ended up. X took place in the 70s, and so it kind of embodied that 70s gritty grindhouse aesthetic, whereas this movie takes place in, I guess, the 1930s or somewhere whereabouts. And so instead of going black and white, which would have been a pretty controversial decision, this movie is a brilliant, colorful, beautiful, technicolor film. It's like The Wizard of Oz if Dorothy needed serious psychiatric intervention. She even meets a nice scarecrow at one point. I love the setup and the characters, but I love even more when things start to get homicidal. Probably the most impactful scene in the movie is this long-ass monologue where it lasts for something like 8 minutes, but then afterwards it switches to this long exterior shot. And I won't spoil exactly how things go, but let's just say things get homicidal, and it's really memorable. I like this movie. I like X even more. These two are great companion pieces, and it's absolutely insane to me that Ty West was able to shoot these two high-quality films almost back to back. Like, that's crazy. Truly a master of his craft. At number 9 is Don't Breathe, and this is one of the most intense movies of all time, in my opinion. The premise is that these three criminals break into the home of this blind army vet played by Stephen Lang, but they are completely unprepared for the lengths that this guy will go to protect his property. So because he's blind, they have to move around without being heard, and that leads to some insanely tense sequences where just Fede Alvarez just utilizes this concept to its absolute fullest potential. And that is not necessarily something that would have been easy to do. I mean, it would have been so easy for this movie to just lapse into being predictable, shallow, and just overstating its case and getting boring by the end. But Don't Breathe never really does that. It basically keeps me on the edge of my seat almost from beginning to end. I also love how morally gray all the characters are. I mean, this isn't necessarily the most complex character study that's ever been put to film, but the heroes of the story are criminals, and the villain of the story, as messed up as he is with some of the crazy places that this movie goes to, you can still feel at least a certain degree of empathy for the situation he's in. And speaking of the crazy places this movie goes to, there's one scene in particular that is surprisingly nasty for like a mainstream Hollywood thriller. I guarantee you, you will not forget it. This is probably not going to be the most rewatchable film on this list, because once you've taken the ride, you already know where all the twists and turns are going to be. But as a single viewing experience, holy crap, it is an injection of adrenaline directly into my veins, and I absolutely love that. At number 8 is Possessor. This is the breakout film from Brandon Cronenberg, and what an opening statement. This one, kind of like Infinity Pool, has this really awesome sci-fi concept that the story spins out from. Basically, in the future, this technology is invented that allows assassins to take control of the bodies of other people, and thus they're able to commit murders, basically evidence-free. And Possessor follows a woman who is one of the best at what she does, but due to the nature of the job, her psychology starts to slip. This movie's pretty brutal. It goes all out on the blood. Like, there are just rivers of blood. But it's not just a gore fest. It's also a really solid psychological thriller. If Brandon Cronenberg continues putting out films like this, he is going to quickly cement himself into the Horror Hall of Fame for sure. At number 7 is Us. And when this movie came out, I heard a lot of reports that it was a disappointment. It was a massive step down from Get Out. A lot of the complaints focused on this idea that the movie sold out its plot in favor of messaging, and so I basically thought that I knew what this movie was, and I skipped it. Thus, like many of the films on this list, I ended up seeing it for the first time in preparation for this video, and what a pleasant surprise this was. This is a really entertaining movie. The main family at the core of this story are just so much fun to follow. They're constantly cracking jokes and just generally being charming, even when things are getting dire. And while there aren't a ton of side characters in this movie, the few that are here make their impact by being lively and hilarious. I do get why some people are bothered by the lack of answers to certain questions and just the unreality inherent in the setup, but I can honestly say it doesn't really bother me. I get what Jordan Peele is going for here, and I don't think the premise demands realism, so for that reason, I actually was more bothered by some of the unrealistic plot points in Nope than I was by this movie. Yeah, I like this movie a lot, and you can come and get me for it. And number 6 is Ready or Not, and this is probably the biggest pleasant surprise on this entire list. I hadn't seen it prior to prepping for this video because I just thought it would be another decent but forgettable horror film that I'd get around to someday, but I was so wrong. This movie gets the blend of horror and comedy just perfectly on point. Like, you'll have a moment where it's super tense. I'm on the edge of my seat like, oh my God, what's gonna happen? And then somebody will walk through a door into this hilarious comical situation, and the next second I'm laughing my ass off. The cast of characters is one of the big reasons why this movie works as well as it does. Samara Weaving is a great lead, and the family that her character is marrying into is filled with just delightfully hateable characters. The personalities are all oversized, but in the best way possible. I love the humor. I love the interactions. This movie is just an absolute blast. And number 5 is Sinister. This one is creepy. The first half of this movie, where Ethan Hawke's character is watching those Super 8 snuff films, is one of the most unsettling things I've ever seen. The second half isn't quite as creepy, but it still works pretty well. But the reason it's so high on this list is because I think it works well as a story too. Like, I feel a lot of sympathy for Ethan Hawke's character, even despite some of the stupid decisions that he makes. And the tension between him and his wife make for some pretty compelling drama. This movie kind of took advantage of that same atmosphere that Origin of Evil did, where it's the supernatural horror mixed with family drama. But I think this movie does it much better than that one did. And honestly, better than almost any other movie from the 2010s. Yeah, this one's pretty awesome. At number 4 is Midsommar. And this is a movie that it took me a while to come around to. When I first saw this thing, I was furious. I thought it was just a self-indulgent bore fest that basically showcased what happens when a director believes his own hype. But I can now see that while there are still some issues with it, I was very wrong in my initial assessment. One element that went completely over my head the first time I saw this movie was the atmosphere of it. When you've got these open fields with bright skies and everybody's wearing white and you've got these flowers and wreaths everywhere, there's a real intoxicating atmosphere to it that I just did not vibe with the first time I saw it. Now I think it's actually one of the main appeals of the movie. And while much of the drama in this movie is not quite as heavy as in Ari Aster's other film, Hereditary, the performances by these actors still sell it. Florence Pugh especially does a great job as this broken protagonist who has to go through this breakup arc, basically, except it involves, brutal death scenes. Midsommar is a pretty solid horror drama, and it's one of the best films on this list. At number 3 is X, and earlier I talked about how Terrifier 2 could have been the next great slasher film, but it fell way short. Well, X is the next great slasher film that Terrifier 2 could have been. Sure, it's not quite as gruesome, and it doesn't have any image that's quite as iconic as Art the Clown, but where T2 failed, this movie soars. For one thing, the pacing here is actually one of the strongest elements of the movie. It's one of the reasons why this thing blows 99% of other slasher films out of the water, because it takes an hour to actually get to the kills, and yet there's never a dull moment. I am 100% with it all the way. I just love following this ensemble of characters as they try to make a dirty movie. And I also love the symbolism of these two characters, both played by Mia Goth, where on the one hand you have Pearl, who's an old lady in this movie who is, regretful and looking at the past. And you have Maxine, who's this young, attractive up-and-comer. And I think the tension between those two characters is at the heart of this movie. And it's what sets it above almost all other slasher films and almost all other horror films in general. Yeah, this movie is excellent. Number 2 is Get Out. This movie is really good. Like with X, I love that for the first 2/3 of the movie, it's not even a horror film. It's just a drama about this guy meeting his girlfriend's parents and like the awkwardness that comes with that. And there's little hints that it's going to be a horror film, but those hints don't pay off until much later in the movie when it makes an abrupt transition into being a horror thriller. And it works on that level too. Even though it's only a full-on horror film for about half an hour, it still makes its mark. One element I've come to appreciate more on multiple viewings is the comedy here. Like, obviously Jordan Peele has a history of doing comedy, and while the humor here isn't quite as overt as it would be in a Key and Peele sketch, there's still a lot of those sensibilities that are at play here. There's an interview that Jordan Peele did where he said that the only difference between horror and comedy is the music. And now I can't unsee that. Like with this movie and with horror in general, I just thought that was a great quote. Then there's the social commentary, which is obviously an aspect you can't look over with this one. And let's just say that if I were to start talking politics with Jordan Peele, I don't know if that we would see eye to eye on very many things, but whether or not you agree with every single societal indictment that's being brought to bear here, you can't deny that the ideas are at least being presented very well. So if you somehow haven't seen this absolute cultural phenomenon of a movie, go see it already. It's great. But at number 1, the only movie I could have put in this spot is Hereditary. For many of the entries, I had to hem and haw about where exactly to place them. For some, I'm frankly still not sure if I placed them correctly, but not this one. When I first saw the 31 on 31 list for this year, my immediate thought was like, wow, this is a pretty stacked list, but also Hereditary is number 1. And yeah, the movies that I've seen since have not changed my opinion on that. Tonight, on the day that I'm recording, I'm actually going to go see it at Regal with my dad because my new hobby is dragging innocent people to the most disturbing movies I can find. And holy crap, this movie is disturbing. It's very difficult to actually bother me with a movie at this point. Maybe occasionally a scene here and there will scare me, but to make an actual full movie that leaves me feeling disturbed and unsettled is a monumental task. But Hereditary is up to that task. This movie basically pulls back the curtain on a lot of things that are normally hidden behind closed doors. It basically shows us this family who's falling apart due to grief and some very horrific situations. It does have some supernatural elements, and it frankly uses them in some of the most spine-tingling ways I've ever seen in a film. But to me, some of the most disturbing scenes are actually the scenes of just this family fighting and falling apart. So yeah, this movie is super dark. It has no chill. It goes straight for the throat. But beyond just being a really effective and disturbing horror movie, it's also just a great story with incredibly well-developed characters and amazing performances. I mean, enough has already been said about Toni Collette's performance in this movie, which is phenomenal, and it's a really great part of why this movie works. But all the central performances of these 4 family members are good, and the characters feel almost painfully real, which is why this is not just one of the greatest horror films of all time, it's actually just a work of art. Yeah, I'm a fan of Hereditary, and in my opinion, it's the best movie on this 31 on 31 list. But what do you guys think? I'm curious to hear from this very small but nevertheless cool audience that I have of subscribers. So make sure to leave a comment. Tell me what you think of however many of these movies you've seen. I'd love to hear from you. And with that said, I will see you in the next review.